In the autumn of 1945, as victory flags still waved across London and crowds celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany, Britain stood at a peculiar crossroads in its history. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the world's population, that had dictated terms from Delhi to Cairo, from Singapore to Cape Town, was now facing a reality more devastating than any military defeat. It was utterly, completely, and catastrophically broke. The cost of victory had been nothing less than the liquidation of 3 centuries of accumulated wealth, power, and global dominance. And in the quiet corridors of Westminster and Whitehall, British officials were about to negotiate what would become the most consequential financial transaction of the 20th century, a deal that would effectively transfer the crown of global supremacy from London to Washington for the sum of $3.75 billion. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must first grasp what Britain had been before the war. In 1939, the British Empire was not merely large, it was the largest empire in human history. It controlled roughly 23% of the world's population and 24% of its land area. British sterling was the world's reserve currency. The City of London was the undisputed financial capital of the planet. British shipping carried more than half of the world's seaborne trade. British investments overseas totaled approximately £4 billion, an astronomical sum representing generations of accumulated capital. From rubber plantations in Malaysia to gold mines in South Africa, from railways in Argentina to textile mills in India, British capital had woven itself into the fabric of the global economy. This wasn't just political power, it was economic architecture that had been built over centuries. But World War II changed everything. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain transformed from the world's largest creditor nation into the world's largest debtor. The statistics are staggering and almost incomprehensible in their scale. Britain lost approximately 1/4 of its national wealth during the war years. Its export trade collapsed by nearly 2/3. The country had liquidated roughly $4.5 billion in overseas investments, assets that had taken generations to build, sold off in a desperate scramble to purchase American weapons, food, and materials. These weren't abstract numbers on a ledger. They represented the systematic dismantling of Britain's economic foundation. Entire portfolios of American securities, painstakingly acquired over decades, were sold at fire sale prices. British-owned companies in Latin America, investments in American railways and utilities, holdings in everything from Canadian breweries to Argentine beef, all of it went on the auction block to keep the war machine running. By 1945, Britain owed approximately $13 billion to various creditors around the world, a debt equal to roughly 130% of its GDP. India alone was owed $1.3 billion, a debt accumulated as Britain essentially forced its colony to finance much of its war effort. Egypt, Iran, and other nations held massive sterling balances, IOUs that Britain had issued in exchange for goods and services during the war. These were nations that had been part of Britain's imperial system, now transformed into creditors holding claims against an empire that could no longer pay. The psychological reversal was as profound as the financial one. The colonizer had become the debtor. The master of global trade had become dependent on the goodwill of its suppliers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had emerged from the war in a position of almost unimaginable strength. While Britain had bankrupted itself, America had gotten rich. U.S. GDP had doubled during the war years. The country now possessed approximately 60% of the world's gold reserves. Its industrial capacity was unmatched. American factories that had produced tanks and bombers could easily pivot to consumer goods. American agriculture could feed not just its own population, but much of the war-torn world. Most significantly, the United States had become the world's creditor. It owed billions to Britain, France, China, and numerous other nations. The dollar, backed by gold and by America's economic might, was positioned to replace sterling as the world's reserve currency. Everything Britain had been, America was becoming. The immediate crisis facing Britain in the summer of 1945 was simple but devastating. The country was running out of dollars. Under the Lend-Lease program, America had supplied Britain with $31 billion worth of materials during the war. Weapons, food, machinery, raw materials, everything needed to keep fighting. This program, initiated by President Roosevelt in 1941, had been presented as aid, but it was more accurately described as a loan of materials rather than money.
Britain had become dependent on this supply line for its very survival. Then, on August 21, 1945, just days after Japan's surrender, President Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The tap was shut off. Britain still needed to import vast quantities of food, raw materials, and goods from the dollar area, but now it would have to pay cash. Cash it simply did not have. The British government, led by the newly elected Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his Chancellor Hugh Dalton, faced an impossible situation. Britain needed to rebuild its devastated economy, maintain its global commitments, feed its population, and somehow preserve its status as a great power. But it was hemorrhaging foreign exchange at an alarming rate. Within months, Britain would be unable to purchase essential imports. The prospect of food shortages, industrial collapse, and economic chaos loomed. British officials calculated that the country needed approximately $5 billion in external financing just to survive the next few years, to bridge the gap until exports could recover and the economy could be rebuilt. This was the context in which John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most influential economist of the 20th century, prepared for his final mission. In September 1945, at the age of 62 and in failing health, Keynes traveled to Washington to negotiate Britain's economic survival. He was accompanied by a small team of Treasury officials, but the burden fell primarily on his shoulders. Keynes understood better than anyone the historical magnitude of what was happening. This was nothing less than the transfer of economic hegemony from one empire to another, wrapped in the language of loans and interest rates.
Keynes arrived in Washington with a strategy that reflected both economic logic and a fundamental misreading of the political moment. His proposal was audacious in its scope. He believed Britain deserved a grant, not a loan, of approximately $6 billion from the United States. His reasoning was sophisticated and, from a British perspective, entirely reasonable. Britain had stood alone against Nazi Germany for nearly 2 years before America entered the war. It had sacrificed its economic future to hold the line against fascism, while America remained officially neutral, profiting from arms sales. British cities had been bombed, British soldiers had died in North Africa and Europe, and the British economy had been systematically stripped of its assets. In Keynes's view, this had been a shared struggle for civilization itself, and America owed Britain compensation for its sacrifices. The money should come as a gift between allies and acknowledgement of Britain's contribution to victory. But Keynes had catastrophically miscalculated the American mood. Washington in 1945 was not interested in gratitude or historical debts of honor. The American negotiators, led by Treasury official William Clayton and banker Fred Vincent, saw the situation through an entirely different lens. To them, Britain was not a heroic ally deserving of charity. It was a declining power clinging to an obsolete imperial system, a country that had consistently blocked American commercial interests through its system of imperial preference and sterling area controls. Many American officials and congressmen viewed the British Empire as an anachronism that needed to be dismantled, not preserved. They saw Britain's request for aid as an opportunity to reshape the post-war economic order according to American principles: free trade, open markets, convertible currencies, and the end of discriminatory trading blocs. The negotiations that followed were brutal and humiliating for the British team. What Keynes had envisioned as a discussion between partners became something closer to terms being dictated to a supplicant. The Americans made clear from the outset that there would be no grant. Any assistance would come as a loan, with interest and with conditions attached. As the weeks dragged into months, the British position steadily deteriorated. Keynes, exhausted and increasingly ill, found himself fighting for every concession. The Americans drove a hard bargain, understanding that Britain had no alternatives. The Soviet Union was not going to provide dollars. Continental Europe was itself devastated and dependent on American aid. Britain was trapped, and the Americans knew it. The final agreement, reached in December 1945 and formalized through the Anglo-American Financial Agreement, provided Britain with a loan of $3.75 billion at 2. The failure of sterling convertibility in 1947 was more than a technical economic setback. It was a psychological breaking point that forced Britain to confront the unbridgeable gap between its imperial ambitions and its post-war capabilities. The country that had financed wars across continents, that had built railways from Cape to Cairo, that had administered a global empire with the pound sterling as its instrument of power, could no longer maintain even the basic fiction of financial sovereignty. The American loan, rather than providing a bridge to recovery, had merely illuminated how far Britain had fallen.
Every dollar spent was a reminder of dependence. Every policy decision now had to be cleared through the lens of Washington's approval. The empire that had dictated terms to the world for centuries was now receiving them. The immediate aftermath of the convertibility crisis forced Britain into a period of grinding austerity that would define the late 1940s. Food rationing, which had been implemented during the war, actually became more severe after victory. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war itself, was rationed from 1946 to 1948. Meat, butter, sugar, and other staples remained strictly controlled. The British people, exhausted from 6 years of war, found themselves enduring continued sacrifice, not to defeat an enemy, but simply to service debts and maintain solvency. The famous British stiff upper lip was tested not by bombs, but by the slow realization that victory had somehow still meant losing. The post-war world was supposed to bring relief and prosperity. Instead, it brought queues, shortages, and the cold mathematics of insolvency. Simultaneously, the geopolitical implications of Britain's financial weakness became impossible to ignore. In 1947, facing bankruptcy and unable to maintain its military commitments, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer afford to support the Greek government against communist insurgents or maintain its traditional role in Turkey. This announcement led directly to the Truman Doctrine, in which America formally assumed responsibility for containing Soviet expansion in the Mediterranean and beyond. What Britain presented as a temporary gap for America to fill was in reality a permanent transfer of strategic responsibility. The torch of global power wasn't being passed ceremonially, it was being dropped out of economic necessity, and America was picking it up because the alternative was watching it extinguish entirely. The pattern repeated itself across the globe with accelerating frequency. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, ending nearly 2 centuries of direct rule over the subcontinent. While this was presented as a noble act of decolonization, the financial reality was stark. Britain could no longer afford to administer India. The cost of maintaining order, of managing the complex transition to independence, of deploying sufficient troops to prevent civil war, all of it was beyond Britain's capacity. The jewel in the crown of the British Empire was relinquished not primarily because of nationalist pressure or moral enlightenment, but because maintaining it had become financially impossible. The sterling balances owed to India, those IOUs accumulated during the war, would never be fully repaid. Independence was in part a bankruptcy restructuring dressed up as liberation. Palestine followed in 1948. Unable to manage the escalating conflict between Jewish and Arab populations, unable to afford the military presence required to maintain order, Britain handed the mandate to the United Nations and withdrew. The same year, Britain began withdrawing from its commitments across the Middle East, reducing garrisons, closing bases, and renegotiating treaties that had guaranteed British influence for decades. In Malaya, where Britain fought a communist insurgency throughout the 1950s, the costs of counterinsurgency warfare strained resources to breaking point. Each colonial commitment became a calculation of cost versus strategic value, and increasingly, Britain was choosing to cut its losses. The empire wasn't being dismantled according to a grand plan, it was being liquidated asset by asset to balance the books. Meanwhile, the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 and implemented from 1948, fundamentally altered the economic landscape of Western Europe. The United States provided over $13 billion in economic assistance to European nations, including approximately $3.2 billion to Britain, nearly as much as the 1946 loan. But this aid came with the same underlying conditions: economic integration, trade liberalization, and alignment with American strategic interests. Britain was being woven into an American-led economic order, one in which the dollar was supreme and Washington set the rules. The Marshall Plan was brilliant in its conception. It rebuilt Europe, created markets for American goods, and bound Western Europe to the United States in a web of economic interdependence that political and military alliance almost inevitable. Britain, grateful for the assistance, found itself becoming a junior partner in an American enterprise rather than the leader of its own sphere. The creation of NATO in 1949 formalized Britain's new status. The alliance was nominally equal, but the reality was transparent. America provided the overwhelming majority of military capability, nuclear deterrence, and funding. Britain contributed what it could, but its role was supplementary rather than central. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for centuries, was now operating in coordination with and often subordinate to the U.S. Navy. British foreign policy, once formulated independently in London, was now coordinated with Washington.
When Britain proposed actions that contradicted American interests, it found itself constrained by economic dependence. The loan of 1946 had created not just a financial obligation, but a structural relationship of dependency that permeated every aspect of British policy. The Korean War in 1950 further illustrated Britain's diminished capability. When the United Nations, at American urging, intervened in Korea, Britain contributed troops as part of its obligation as a major ally. But the effort strained Britain's already overstretched military and economic resources. The rearmament program required to support the Korean intervention and broader Cold War commitments triggered another balance of payments crisis. Once again, Britain found itself running short of dollars, once again forced to implement austerity measures, once again dependent on American goodwill to avoid catastrophe. The pattern had become a cycle: economic crisis, American assistance with conditions, temporary stabilization, renewed crisis. Britain was trapped on a treadmill of managed decline. The Suez Crisis of 1956 would provide the most dramatic and humiliating demonstration of Britain's new reality. When Britain, France, and Israel conspired to seize the Suez Canal after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it, the United States reacted with fury. President Eisenhower, unwilling to support what he viewed as old-fashioned imperial adventurism and concerned about Soviet reactions, used economic pressure to force Britain to withdraw. The mechanism was simple but devastating. America refused to support sterling and hinted it might sell its holdings, which would have triggered a catastrophic devaluation. Britain, facing a run on the pound and unable to access International Monetary Fund resources without American approval, had no choice but to accept a humiliating withdrawal. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. The message was unmistakable. Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage if America disapproved. The loan of 1946 and the subsequent decade of financial dependence had given America a veto over British foreign policy. By the late 1950s, the transformation was complete. Britain had formally accepted its role as a secondary power, a loyal ally of the United States, rather than an independent pole of global influence. The special relationship between Britain and America, celebrated in London as a partnership of equals, was in reality a relationship of patron and client, although one conducted with diplomatic courtesy and historical nostalgia. British politicians spoke of punching above our weight in international affairs, a phrase that acknowledged the fundamental reality. Britain's actual weight was now limited, and any influence it retained came from skillful diplomacy and association with American power rather than from independent capability.
The final repayment of the 1946 loan occurred on December 29, 2006, 60 years after the agreement was signed. On that day, Britain transferred its last payment of $83 million to the United States Treasury, closing the books on a debt that had spanned 3 generations. The loan, which had seemed so desperately necessary in 1945, had cost Britain approximately $7.5 billion when all interest and inflation adjustments were calculated. But the true cost could never be measured in dollars alone. What Britain had really purchased with that loan was time, a few more years to pretend it was still a great power, a gradual rather than catastrophic descent from empire to middle power, the ability to manage decline with dignity rather than collapse into chaos. Whether that time was worth the price remains one of the great counterfactual questions of 20th century history. The loan and its consequences fundamentally reshaped the global order in ways that extended far beyond Britain's borders. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, had created the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as instruments of a new international economic architecture. But it was the failure of sterling and the success of the dollar in the late 1940s that truly cemented this system. The dollar, backed by American gold reserves and economic might, became the unquestioned global reserve currency. International trade was increasingly conducted in dollars. Central banks held their reserves in dollars. Oil and commodities were priced in dollars. This dollar hegemony gave the United States extraordinary advantages. It could run trade deficits without the immediate consequences other nations faced. It could impose financial sanctions with devastating effect, and it could borrow in its own currency at favorable rates. The economic architecture that emerged from World War II was fundamentally American, and the loan to Britain had been a critical step in establishing that dominance. The British Empire's dissolution, accelerated by financial constraints, created a power vacuum that America filled selectively. Where Britain withdrew, America often stepped in, but not everywhere and not always permanently. In the Middle East, American oil companies and strategic interests replaced British influence. In Southeast Asia, America inherited Britain's role as the primary Western power, leading eventually to the Vietnam War. In Africa, the retreat of British colonialism created opportunities for both American influence and Soviet competition during the Cold War. The decolonization of the 1950s and 1960s, while driven by nationalist movements and moral arguments, was enabled by Britain's financial incapacity to maintain control. The map of the world was being redrawn not by military conquest, but by economic realities and the flow of capital. For Britain itself, the post-war decades brought a painful adjustment to reduced circumstances.
The economy recovered slowly, hampered by outdated infrastructure, strong labor unions, inefficient industries, and persistent balance of payments problems. Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, a decision that would have been unthinkable in 1945, when British leaders still imagined their country as separate from and superior to continental Europe. Even this step was taken reluctantly, after France had twice vetoed British membership, and after it became clear that Britain's economic future lay in integration with Europe, rather than in nostalgic dreams of empire and commonwealth. The country that had once stood alone was now seeking safety in collective European structures, accepting that sovereignty could be pooled because independent sovereignty was increasingly hollow. The social contract in Britain also transformed dramatically. The welfare state constructed by the Labour government after 1945, the National Health Service, expanded social security, nationalized industries, was built partly on borrowed American money. British socialism, as conservatives in Washington had feared, was indeed partially financed by the 1946 loan. But this created a peculiar legacy. Britain developed a comprehensive welfare system, while simultaneously accepting subordination to American strategic and economic interests. The British people gained social protections and economic security, even as their nation lost global power. For ordinary citizens, this might have been a reasonable trade. Empire and prestige mattered less than healthcare and housing. But for British elites and policymakers, the adjustment was psychologically devastating, a generation-long process of learning to think smaller and accept limitations. The nuclear deterrent became Britain's last claim to great power status. After America cut off nuclear cooperation following World War II, Britain independently developed atomic weapons, successfully testing its first bomb in 1952. The nuclear program was extraordinarily expensive, consuming resources that might have been invested in economic modernization. But for British leaders, it was essential. Nuclear weapons were the entrance fee to continue sitting at the table with America and the Soviet Union. Yet even here, Britain eventually became dependent on American technology and cooperation. The Polaris and later Trident missile systems were purchased from the United States, and Britain's nuclear deterrent operated only with American technical support and permission. Independence was once again revealed as largely illusory. The special relationship between Britain and America evolved into a complex mixture of genuine strategic partnership, historical sentiment, and hard-nosed calculation. Britain provided diplomatic support, intelligence cooperation through the Five Eyes network, and military contributions to American operations from the Cold War through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In return, Britain received privileged access to American intelligence, military technology, and diplomatic consultation. But the relationship was never truly equal, and moments of crisis, from Suez in 1956 to debates over the Iraq War in 2003, repeatedly demonstrated where ultimate power resided. British prime ministers from Churchill to Blair understood that maintaining American favor was essential to Britain's security and influence, which meant that when Washington had strong preferences, London generally aligned. Looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the $3.75 billion loan of 1946 appears less as a discrete transaction than as a symbolic moment in a much larger historical shift. What really happened in that negotiation wasn't simply the transfer of money, it was the formal acknowledgement of a new hierarchy in global affairs. Britain, exhausted by war and bankrupted by victory, accepted that it could no longer afford its empire or its pretensions to primacy. America, enriched by war and positioned to dominate the post-war world, offered assistance but on terms that restructured the international order according to American principles and interests. The loan was the price Britain paid not for survival, the country would have survived regardless, but for a managed transition, for the ability to step down from empire with some measure of control rather than experiencing complete collapse. The broader lesson transcends Britain and America specifically. The story of the loan illuminates a fundamental truth about power in the modern world. Economic capacity ultimately determines geopolitical influence. Military might, diplomatic skill, and historical prestige all matter, but they rest on a foundation of economic strength. When that foundation crumbles, everything else follows. Britain learned this the hard way between 1945 and 1956. Its empire had been built on centuries of accumulated capital, industrial leadership, and financial dominance. When World War II destroyed that economic base, the empire itself became untenable within a generation. No amount of military prowess or diplomatic cleverness could compensate for fundamental economic weakness. Today, as analysts debate the potential decline of American hegemony and the rise of China, the Anglo-American experience of 1945-1956 offers instructive parallels. The transition from Britain to American dominance was not sudden. It unfolded over decades and was marked by denial, resistance, and gradual accommodation to new realities. It involved not just changes in power relationships, but fundamental restructuring of economic systems, alliances, and international institutions. And it demonstrated that transitions between hegemons, while potentially peaceful, are never painless for the declining power. The memories of empire linger long after the substance has vanished, creating a gap between national self-perception and actual capabilities that can persist for generations. Britain did eventually find a new role, as a prosperous middle power, a financial center, a cultural influence, and a committed member of international institutions. The country that had once ruled an empire adapted to being a significant but not dominant player in a world where power was more widely distributed. The adjustment took decades and involved considerable national trauma, but Britain ultimately proved that decline did not mean disaster. The society remained democratic, prosperous, and influential even after the empire had become a historical memory. The $3.75 billion loan, in the end, bought more than Britain's immediate survival.